Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out devx.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
My name is Adva Saldinger. I am a senior reporter at DevX, and I'm filling in as host this week. And I am joined by my colleagues, Colm Lynch, who is a senior global reporter, and Alyssa Mulin, who focuses on U.S. government coverage for us here at DevX. So Colm and Alyssa, hello.
Hey, Adva. Thanks for having us.
Good morning. Thanks for having us today.
Absolutely. So we're going to dive into some of the stories that we've published this week shortly, but we are all US-based reporters, and it has been an eventful few weeks in US politics. So I wanted to start by getting some of your thoughts. Obviously, President Biden decided to drop his bid for reelection, and Vice President Kamala Harris is now poised to be the Democratic nominee taking on Republican Donald Trump. From what we know, they present two quite different perspectives on sort of U.S. foreign aid and what the U.S. posture will be. And would love to get your thoughts on what we might expect from both Harris and Trump. Alyssa, I know you've done some reporting on Project 2025, which is this huge set of recommendations from a conservative think tank. There's been some debate. Trump has tried to sort of distance himself from those, some of those suggestions, though a lot of the people who wrote that document were part of his previous administration. So would love to start by getting your thoughts on, what we might expect to see from a Trump administration or a Harris administration.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Adva. I think, starting with the Project 2025, I think though in recent days and weeks, Trump has really backed away from Project 2025. Most folks really agree that it doesn't really matter that much. The document was written by a number of folks that have worked with him in the past and kind of a lot of people ingrained in that Trump orbit. So most individuals that I speak to really still are using it as a guidebook in terms of, okay, this is what we're expecting. Trump did come out with his own kind of platform that was later endorsed by the Republicans, but it's pretty short, simple, kind of a lot of one sentences. So it doesn't really get into too much about foreign policy and especially not foreign assistance. But there are some things I think, as people are thinking about like, okay, what might a Trump foreign assistance or foreign policy plan look like? Most are still going back to Project 2025. As you mentioned, we also assume that Harris's will be a very, very different take on all of this. A lot of it will be quite similar to the way that we've seen President Biden's foreign assistance and foreign policy. I was just at a press conference yesterday at Capitol Hill, and the senator there said he wasn't seeing a ton of daylight between whether it be Israel and Hamas war types of issues, or whether it be China, between Harris and Biden. So some of the same, though there will be some differences as well. I think in terms of what we're seeing so far, Harris has shown a commitment to a number of human rights issues, LGBTQ plus communities, women's rights, reproductive health, especially here at home, but also across the world. And that's quite different from what we're seeing from Project 2025, which is hoping to kind of bring a very pro-life take to the international development and domestic space.
I agree. With Alyssa, I think that we'll see status quo pretty much with a Harris administration. I think one thing that's interesting about 2025 is that it was such a detailed plan that it was sort of, it was bringing to the surface a whole series of issues that have become difficult for the Republicans, particularly promotion of sort of pro-life agenda, anti-abortion agenda, which I think Trump has kind of, at least in the campaign, has moved away from, and is felt that that's an area where they could lose votes and that hurt them in the midterm elections. But one thing about the document is that essentially what it does, when the Trump administration came into office, there was a lot of ambition to try and transform the federal bureaucracies, but they just didn't have a plan. They didn't have the personnel to fill these posts. And so, in the last couple of years, a lot of people in kind of the Trump orbit have been trying to sort of plan, come together with like, how do we actually make this happen? How do we get, all of the, how do we sort of dismantle the deep state, as they call it, to, change, to get rid of, some of the civil servants, foreign policy experts who they feel are biased towards the Democratic Party. And I mean, J.D. Vance, sort of in an interview, in a radio interview, talked about the need to for the de-Ba'athification of the federal agencies, fire all the people who are in there and replace them with our own people. And if anybody, kind of remembers what the de-Ba'athification program was about, it was about trying to put a kind of, to drive out people who were part of Saddam Hussein's political party, the Ba'ath political party, after the U.S. intervention. And it sort of did dismantle the state structures and, led to chaos within Iraq. I mean, it sort of contributed to the chaos after the U.S. intervention. It was largely kind of viewed in hindsight as a terrible idea. So I don't know. I think whether Vance, who was in the military, probably understands what it means perfectly well. Maybe the Republicans think that, people don't remember that. But so that's kind of problematic. But if you look at, the sections on USAID and the State Department, you see very much the priorities that were that they tried to impose during the Trump administration, anti-abortion, aligning U.S. foreign aid with U.S. foreign policy, national security policy, a whole series of issues like that, ditching any discussion or focus on climate change, getting USAID to support oil and gas, developments, things like that. So, a radical difference from what we would expect from the Democrats. But also, despite the denials that former President Trump has made and efforts to disassociate himself, I mean, this is basically the plan that his administration tried to carry out, almost 4 years ago.
Yeah, and I would just add, because one of the things I look at obviously is the budget, and I think the budget that House Republicans put forward that passed through the House this year probably gives us an indication of some of what they would want to do, which is probably some pretty significant cuts to the foreign aid budget, moving away from multilateralism. We saw that certainly in the first Trump administration, with leaving UN organizations, leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think we would probably expect to see much of the same. Some of the multilateral organizations, I think, would probably get no funding. The U.S. would, refuse their ability to or the U.S. would withdraw from them. So I think there's some interesting things we might see there. I wanted to sort of switch gears and turn to you, Colm. You had an exclusive this week that is, kind of connected to USAID, but it's really this saga of getting aid and how to most effectively get aid into Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen. And the decision that the U.S. is likely going to restart aid after stopping aid to that region about a year ago. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of what's at stake and the background in this situation?
Sure. So, I mean, I've been writing on this story. I've had a few stories on this over the past year, but essentially, despite, in addition to the fact that the U.S., Israel, are in a significant conflict with the Houthis and have been exchanging fire since the October 7th attack by Hamas against Israeli civilians, Yemen continues to be one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. And the international community, mostly World Food Program, provide food assistance and other assistance to millions of Yemeni people. There has been sort of concerns over a number of issues in northern Yemen, which is controlled by Houthi rebels, sort of Iranian-backed group that has sort of been in power since, over the, I think since 2014, 2015, the de facto power in the north. And so, A couple of things have been happening. One is that the World Food Program, like many other NGOs and international agencies, have seen a drop in donations to the organization. So they're having to do more with less. And so they determined that in the north, where they used to provide food assistance to 9 million people, that they couldn't afford to do that anymore. They were going to have to bring it down to over 6 million. So there would be 3 million people who had received food assistance who wouldn't be receiving it. So in order to do that, they were trying to work with the Houthis to come up with an agreement where they could establish, in their view, who were the neediest people in that area, and they got a lot of pushback from the Houthis. This is an important kind of part of the patronage system that the Houthis can guarantee that that their followers and people in their area can all receive the food they need. They express some concern that it might be destabilizing, but they've been in a long fight. And then behind the scenes, there's this concern about the degree to which food aid is used to advance Houthis' war aims, the ability that they've had to manipulate distribution so that it goes to people that they want it to go to. So this was an effort to try and rationalize the process to make sure that food was going to the neediest. They couldn't get agreement for the Houthis, so the Americans last August, had 2 major shiploads of wheat and other goods that were headed towards northern Yemen, and they redirected them to ports in the United Arab Emirates. And they did that as a way of trying to strengthen the World Food Program's negotiating strategy with the Houthis so that they could compel the Houthis to agree to a kind of retargeting process that allowed the UN to sort of try to come up with some basic information on who was the neediest. So this has gone on for a year. The negotiations have been very difficult. The World Food Program established a kind of pilot program to see if they could succeed in the retargeting. The latest sort of evidence is that WFP felt that there was sufficient enough cooperation that they could start to roll out, kind of more delivery of food aid. And so our story this week was about how the U.S. kind of quietly agreed and conveyed, its willingness to the World Food Program that it would be willing to unlock those. It's now 60,000 metric tons of food and other goods, and allow the WFP, as soon as they made a formal request to it, that they would allow that stuff to go to northern Yemen. So it's been very politically sensitive. The process is moving forward very gradually. They're not going to formally restart the program. They have a pilot program, an emergency program that's going to start in August, where they're going to reach out to 1 million people and then try to sort of work on ways to expand it so that they could kind of reestablish, pretty much full, deliveries to 6 million Houthis. And in the process of this, they've been engaged in all sorts of difficulties and battles with the Houthis, who recently detained 13 UN workers along with other NGOs, and other groups in the region, and had threatened to force the UN out of the country if they don't agree to a number of terms, including not significantly decreasing the number of recipients of aid, which is in a sense also not consistent with the agreements that they've given to the UN on their willingness to sort of retarget aid to the 6 million versus the 9 million. So kind of a lot of convoluted pieces to that, but essentially we're sort of moving back towards reestablishing that relationship with the Houthis, and this is playing out in a very difficult political and military moment when the Houthis are basically at war with Israel and exchanging fire with American forces in the region.
And to put it in perspective, what's at stake? Because all these politics are making it difficult to come to an agreement, but what's at stake for people living in this region in Yemen who haven't maybe had access to the food that they had because of all these political back and forth? I mean, the situation there at this point is quite dire for many of these people, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty existential for civilians in northern Yemen. And there haven't been sort of extensive studies on the impact that the pause, I mean, as I also didn't mention, but as part of this process back in December, the World Food Program announced a pause on its general food delivery. They still deliver some emergency aids, for school feeding programs and to child nutrition programs, but the basic program that they have is not operating. But the UN chief emergency relief coordinator Joyce Masuya made a comment recently to the UN Security Council where she was saying that that basically 1 in every 2 children under the age of 5 are now estimated to be experiencing chronic malnutrition or stunting. In Houthi-controlled areas, that's throughout Yemen, and in Houthi-controlled areas, nearly 1 in 10 households are, rely on, alms or, begging basically in order to obtain food. So there are serious hardships. It's not clear what the specific numbers on nutrition levels are at this point, but I mean this is like basically this is the moral dilemma for aid delivery in conflict zones around the world: Ethiopia, Somalia, Yemen. Can you justify cutting off humanitarian assistance that will lead to severe hardships for civilians because the de facto power is doing things that are offensive or repugnant or or use the aid to promote their own interests and needs.
Definitely an incredibly complex situation, and one that I know you will continue to track, so folks should keep an eye out for any future developments.
Are you looking for the inside story on what's happening at organisations like the World Bank, USAID or the Gates Foundation? Then you need to be reading DevEx Pro. I'm Jessica Abrahams and I'm the editor of DevEx Pro. Pro is DevEx's premium news subscription, where our expert reporters and analysts take you beyond the headlines, deep into the trends and institutions shaping the $200 billion aid industry. As well as all our news, you'll get access to conversations with global development leaders, resources to help you grow in your career, and a subscriber-only newsletter full of insider news and tidbits. See for yourself by getting a free trial today at devex.com/pro.
Alyssa, I wanted to turn to you. You moderated an event last week as part of our DevEx Pro Week about localization, and you've been covering sort of USAID's efforts on that front as well. And one of the takeaways that stood out to me was this idea that money isn't enough. That it's not just about how do you redirect monies to local organizations, but really how do you make programs more responsive and change the way the system works so that it really addresses the needs of communities. And I had a really interesting conversation last week with a indigenous Guatemalan leader who was here visiting DC, and his community actually has a case against the Inter-American Development Bank. And one of the things that stood out to me from that conversation is he just said that their definition or view of development was so different than that of his community, and the way that they would define development or their needs, and that they believe that they can get the things that they need in terms of development without destroying the lands that they've lived on for many years. And so I wanted to sort of turn to you and ask you, what can you tell us about USAID's efforts, not just on sort of redirecting more funding, but really looking beyond that as well. Maybe in the interim, I'll go to Colm quickly and just get your thoughts on how some of these sort of conversations around localization are playing out at the UN.
I mean, the issue of localization is sort of it's sort of a topic that is very sexy. Everybody wants to talk about it. But there are certain, questions about how effectively it's working. So at USAID, for instance, I think they had a kind of study or figures coming out that sort of a certain percentage of aid, like 9% of aid, goes towards localization to local communities, and that, everybody thinks it's a good idea to start channeling more aid to local NGOs rather than the big, corporate institutions that generally kind of dominate that space. And it's turned out that there was a recent study by a research group looking that felt that those numbers were actually exaggerating. The number is much smaller; it's closer to a little over 5%. So I think all of the talk about localization and the need to sort of really refocus international assistance around promoting more on the ground individual local communities and directing and controlling the course of the way that aid is distributed, delivered, and used, is still not there. And, there are, one of the things that, I would worry about is, when you talk about localization and, there's this critique of these big Western aid, donors that kind of dominate the space, is like, if you basically channel the money to local NGOs, it's hard to convince parliaments and Congress to support foreign aid and foreign assistance. And, whether, these larger corporations are acting in a cynical way or not, they have a lot more lobbying power in Washington. I mean, imagine what aid for U.S. aid to the World Food Program would be like if you didn't have the American agro industry and shipping industry, who profit enormously from the project, really promoting and advancing it. What would it mean if you have the recipients of aid are not that are not constituents of lawmakers in the United States? That's a sort of one of the downsides, I think, that we don't see at this point, but really could be a problem. So I would leave it at that.
Alyssa, I'll come back to you if you can hear us now, and really just wanted to get your thoughts on how you're seeing this localization conversation play out at USAID specifically.
So yeah, thanks for the question, Adva. I think there's a lot of different things going on here. Like Colm said, there's this, kind of, some people are pushing for outright localization, the more the better, kind of, let's get the money into the hands of local organizations. Others are kind of thinking, okay, let's kind of hold on a bit and let's see what the space is like for big NGOs, for the UN, for local organizations, and just kind of the way in which roles may change, but they, organizations might get smaller, but they won't necessarily disappear. So, I think talking to a lot of different individuals about, really what those ways of working will be in the future, people have different ideas. But for INGOs, at least, it's really been kind of a role shift of individuals or organizations kind of doing less implementation and more kind of support, whether it be for donor support, financial support, advocacy support, being kind of like a financial, whether it be holding funds or helping disperse or, that kind of thing. So it's changing, or at least conversations are here about changing the way in which development is delivered and operated. And at the same time, I do think that the voices of folks in the Global South are just growing stronger in terms of kind of, I think at one of our events, someone just mentioned, like we're kind of done waiting, and we're just going to kind of see what happens as we continue pushing for more power, kind of more funding, more decision making. At USAID in particular, I think we've been spending a lot of time just kind of looking at the numbers as they try to really advance along their 25% by 25 target. And they're at just over 9% now. So there's still quite a ways to go in just 2 years. And it remains to be seen how close the organization will get to that overall target.
There was another story we had this week that sort of pointed to some of the policy or regulatory barriers that might also prevent sort of a push to localization, which really looked at the example of Belgium and asked this question of why countries mainly fund their own NGOs. And I don't know if either of you want to sort of comment more on that, but it was sort of striking that Belgium has this rather complex accreditation process. And so less than 2% of civil society funding to organizations goes to orgs in the Global South. And they have to sort of partner with Belgian organizations to get it.
I mean, it just shows you like the degree to which politics, you can't divorce politics from these issues and also self-interest. So it's not surprising that, Western donor countries, despite all the rhetoric about the need for localization, at the end of the day, when they're cutting a check for aid, that they want to make sure that that aid advances the interest of their own companies, businesses, and, to a certain degree, they kind of reinforce that in terms of, as I mentioned before, big donor agencies often have political, leverage in capitals, and they work on lawmakers and others to make sure money keeps coming to them. And there's no, natural constituency in a foreign country that can apply pressure besides, shame and guilt to get governments to stop doing that, right? So, and one of the things that, I mean, this article sort of brought out is the degree to which the regulatory process becomes a hindrance to changing that system. So, things like if you want to apply for, if you want to bid for a contract or you want to apply for some program, you need to do it in, the local language. You can't do it in, whatever the languages are in the country that's receiving the assistance or where NGOs are receiving the assistance. So, you can have a policy which says you want to go in the direction of greater localization, but you can also see that, lawmakers may have an interest in erecting regulation and laws that make it very difficult to actually do that. So, and often, it's justified on the basis of ensuring that, assistance is delivered without corruption, but that also just becomes a vehicle for ensuring that money stays in the pockets of agencies that are closer to home.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been talking a lot about sort of the public money, this official development assistance, but we had a recent story that I thought was really interesting about remittances. And remittances actually far eclipse at this point the amount of public monies in the development space. And I'm wondering what you guys thought about this piece and sort of how do you harness the power of all these resources that are being sent back to low and middle income countries to really further development aims?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think this story was fascinating. For folks who haven't read it, do take a read. I mean, you think about remittances as just kind of this thing that's happening kind of in the background, right? We're talking so much about ODA and kind of these vast sums of money flowing through official capacities, but this cash is flowing from family to family, right? Or from friends to friends. And what the article does is it kind of spells out a lot of the impact. For example, Sri Lanka was one that remittance receiving households had children with higher birth weights, and that those in El Salvador saw much lower school dropout rates, which is just kind of a interesting and wild specific impact that we're seeing of this cash flow. And I think that the article also points out that what we can see is this is similar to unconditional cash transfers, which is something that is often used in development, right? To give cash directly to recipients and have them kind of make their own choices about what they're spending it on and what they need. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things to learn here in the development space in terms of, what happens when you program that cash, how are remittances being looked at, as a development kind of, how they're being looked at as something that can help with development, whether it be health, poverty, et cetera. So there's a lot here, and it's super interesting space to explore.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting too. I mean, also the notion that as you look out into the future, I mean, one of the biggest sort of global crises we face is the expansion of kind of the refugee population, the displaced population globally, and it's a tragic story. But the one slight silver lining is that it's likely to kind of boost remittances in the coming years. And so, I don't know, there's 600 and plus $50 billion, in the last year in remittances, which is more than ODA and foreign direct investment combined, which is pretty extraordinary. So, but the question is really, and this story kind of flicks at that, is like, how do you channel that into kind of improving development? I mean, the way that money flows into the countries individually through families is not going to address major, issues involving infrastructure development, climate adaptation, and those kind of issues. So you're very much reliant on the private sector, on public funding for that sort of things. But it's a very, very large amount of money, and it sort of indirectly impacts development, but it just does it kind of, in an informal way. And so, the real interesting thing is how are they going to find a way? How do you find a way to actually channel this into a resource base that can help you address a lot of these issues that that do lack resources. So that was pretty interesting.
Yeah. So we are short on time, but Alyssa, I wanted to just see if you would tell us a little bit about USAID's new digital policy. I know you wrote a story about that. What do people need to know about this new policy? How might it change things at the agency?
Yeah. So, like it seems like every sector in the world, digital AI implications are also affecting development and humanitarian programming too. And this is something USAID kind of brings to the fore in their new digital policy. So this policy is for 10 years. It's kind of a roadmap that will look at the institution's approach to AI and emerging technologies over the next decade. And it's pretty interesting. I mean, there's kind of three main takeaways from this policy. I mean, one is that USAID really wants to help expand digital connectivity. So talking a lot about folks, especially women, who are still unconnected, and kind of this disparity that occurs when really incredible technological programs are implemented, but people can't access them. So that's one piece. The second piece is kind of using the digital space to really kind of highlight and bring up more impact. So, if you can connect folks, there is the opportunity for pretty incredible work to be done. I mean, one example was an app in Tanzania, which I think has expanded out to one or two other African countries at this point, but that connects female, whether pregnant mothers to hospitals through volunteer drivers. So it's kind of like an Uber for pregnant women is, I think, kind of what the catchline is. So that's something that's really interesting. But the third is also kind of the fight on misinformation and kind of specific targets for example, China and Russia are called out in this policy. You're using digital tools for whether it be kind of censorship or surveillance, information manipulation. So that's a big focus of this particular policy is just kind of how to protect nations from misinformation and how to protect communities from what the U.S. feels are kind of the wrong types of ways to use technology. And so it really gets into a lot of interesting bits and pieces there. I think overall too, like another big takeaway is just that everything is really changing as AI gets more and more, kind of advanced, and we're seeing changes just within our daily workflows with ChatGPT and Claude and all sorts of other AI tools. And USAID is definitely thinking through how that'll change their programming.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite interesting. And I know we've had quite a bit of coverage on AI recently. And I think it just, from everyone I'm talking to, every organization is trying to figure out how to adapt to it. And it's kind of a learn as we go kind of thing, especially as the technology evolves very rapidly. I wanted to also mention one story that we published earlier this week. It was an exclusive about Crown Agents, which is one of the largest FCDO UK development contractors. And basically what we reported was that they could be days away from closing its doors. They have about 340 staff in 20 countries. And I think, I would stay tuned to DevX because I think pretty soon we're going to have news that maybe that closure has happened. And there's a lot at stake there. They're sort of scrambling to find other organizations to deliver on some of the projects they have if this closure does happen. So that piece is worth a read. And just before we sign off, I wanted to let you know that This Week in Global Development is taking a short break, and we'll be off next week, but we'll be back with a new episode on August 15th. So Colum and Alyssa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Not at all. Thanks, Eva.
Thanks so much.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a DevX Pro member by going to devx.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.